When Thomas Cole struck gold in the foothills of Stone Creek Valley, the townsfolk called it luck. When the widow Spencer cornered him into marriage 3 months later, they called it justice. But when the supposedly barren woman's belly began to swell with child, they had no words, only whispers that followed the couple like shadows through the dusty streets of redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. February 1876 brought the harshest winter anyone in Redemption could remember. Snow piled high against the weathered clapboard buildings, and the wind howled through the mountain passes like a wounded animal. Inside the Rusty Nail Saloon, Thomas Cole hunched over his whiskey, his calloused hands wrapped around the glass as if it might warm the chill that had settled in his bones long before the first snowfall. "Another," he muttered, sliding the empty glass toward Barney, the bartender who'd been serving drinks in Redemption since before it even had a proper name. "Might want to slow down there, Tom," Barney said, pouring anyway. "That claim of yours ain't going nowhere in this weather." "Neither am I," Thomas replied, his voice rough from disuse. He'd spent the past 3 months alone in his cabin on the edge of town, venturing out only for supplies and the occasional drink when the silence became too heavy to bear. The saloon door swung open, bringing with it a blast of frigid air and the imposing figure of Sheriff Holden. The lawman stomped snow from his boots before making his way to the bar, nodding curtly to the handful of men scattered around the room. "Evening, Barney." "Tom." He settled onto the stool beside Thomas, motioning for a drink. "Thought I might find you here." Thomas grunted in acknowledgement but said nothing. He had little use for conversation these days, especially with the sheriff, whose eyes carried that same mixture of pity and judgment he'd come to recognize from everyone in town. "Heard from Wilkins you've been blasting up at your claim." "The sheriff said after a moment. "In this weather, man's got a right to work his own land. Man's also got a right to not freeze to death doing it." Sheriff Holden sipped his whiskey. "But that ain't why I'm here." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Ever since he'd struck that vein of gold last fall, a discovery that had transformed him overnight from a struggling prospector to the richest man in the county, it seemed everyone had a reason to seek him out. "Town council meeting tomorrow," the sheriff continued. "Judge Parker's riding in from Carson City. Thought you should know." "And why would I care about that?" Sheriff Holden fixed him with a level gaze. "Because they're discussing the Spencer situation." The glass in Thomas's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, too carefully, betraying the sudden tremor in his fingers. "There is no situation," he said flatly. 3 months dead and buried, and Jacob Spencer's affairs still ain't settled. That widow of his living alone up there, in that big house, no family to speak of." The sheriff shook his head. "It ain't right, Tom, and you know it. What ain't right is a man getting trampled by his own spooked horse, not 50 yards from my claim," Thomas snapped. "What ain't right is half this town thinking I had something to do with it, because we argued over the property line the week before. Nobody's saying they don't have to say it." Thomas drained his glass in one swallow, welcoming the burn. "It's in their eyes when I walk down the street, in the way conversation stops when I enter a room." The sheriff sighed. "That'll pass. In time, but right now there's the matter of the widow. What about her? We barely exchanged 2 words before Jacob died." "Maybe so. But you own the land her house sits on now, the land her husband was disputing with you, the very piece of earth he died arguing over." Thomas pushed back from the bar, tossing coins onto the scarred wood. "I didn't ask for his claim to be included in that strike zone. The mining office made that decision, which is exactly why you need to be at that meeting tomorrow," Sheriff Holden persisted. "They're talking about forcing a resolution. A cold that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside settled in Thomas's gut." "What kind of resolution?" "The permanent kind." The sheriff's eyes held a warning. Judge Parker's old-fashioned believes in solving problems the way they did when this was still frontier territory. Thomas stared at him, disbelief giving way to anger. You can't be serious. I wish I wasn't. Sheriff Holden finished his drink. But there's talk that the only honorable solution is for you to marry the widow. Give her your name, protection, a share in the gold that should have been her husband's anyway. The laughter that burst from Thomas held no humor. Marriage? To a woman I don't know? A woman who likely thinks I'm responsible for her husband's death? He shook his head. They can't force that. This isn't the Dark Ages. No, but it's still a mining town with more men than law, and the closest circuit judge is 2 days' ride when there isn't 3 feet of snow on the ground. The sheriff stood, adjusting his coat. Just be there, Tom. 10 o'clock town hall. Maybe you can talk some sense into them. After the sheriff left, Thomas remained at the bar, the untouched whiskey before him no longer appealing. Marriage to Margaret Spencer. The very idea was absurd. He'd seen her only at a distance. A tall, stern-faced woman with copper hair, always, pulled back so severely it looked painful. Jacob had spoken of her rarely, and when he did, it was with a curious mixture of pride and disappointment. No children, he'd told Thomas once, during a rare friendly moment before their dispute. The good Lord saw fit to deny us that blessing. Sometimes I think it's punishment for taking a woman 12 years my junior, but Maggie never complains. Strong woman, my wife. Too strong, maybe, for her own good. Thomas signaled for another drink, trying to imagine being tied to such a woman for the rest of his days. It wasn't that he opposed marriage in principle. Before the gold, before redemption, there had been Emily back in Ohio. Sweet, laughing Emily with her dreams of a little house and a garden. But she died of typhoid before they could wed, and Thomas had headed west with her memory and little else. Now, at 35, he'd resigned himself to solitude. The gold strike had finally given him the means to live comfortably, to perhaps even return east someday and start fresh. But marriage to the widow Spencer would chain him to redemption forever. Trouble brewing, Tom? Barney asked, refilling his glass without being asked. You could say that, Thomas muttered. Sheriff thinks the town council's fixing to marry me off to Margaret Spencer. The bartender's eyebrows shot up. Huh. Well, that would solve a few problems, I suppose. Not for me, it wouldn't. No? Barney leaned in, his voice dropping. Way I see it, you've got a woman who needs looking after. A town that's looking at you sideways since Jacob's accident, and more money than any man needs alone. Marriage might settle things down. I don't need things settled, Thomas growled. I need to be left alone to work my claim in peace. Peace is hard to come by when half the town thinks you've wronged a widow, Barney observed, wiping down the bar. Besides, Margaret Spencer ain't the worst match a man could make. Proper lady. From back east, keeps to herself. Can't give you children, of course, but that's enough. Thomas stood abruptly. I'm not marrying anyone, especially not a woman who probably blames me for her husband's death. Barney shrugged. Suit yourself. But that council meeting might go easier if you at least act like you're considering it. Outside, the snow had piled even higher, forming drifts that reached the saloon windows. Thomas pulled his coat tight around him and began the trudge back to his cabin, the wind biting at his face like tiny knives. The moon hung low and full, over the mountains, casting an eerie blue light over the sleeping town. As he passed the general store, his eyes were drawn to a solitary figure standing on the steps of the small white church across the street. Even at a distance, he recognized the rigid posture of Margaret Spencer, her black mourning dress stark against the snow. She stood motionless, face turned up toward the stained glass window where a feeble light still burned. Perhaps Pastor Matthew's working late, or simply a candle left lit against the darkness. For a moment Thomas considered crossing the street, introducing himself properly, explaining that whatever the town council had in mind, he had no intention of imposing on her life. But something in her solitary vigil stopped him. There was a privacy to her grief that demanded respect, even from the man the town had cast as her antagonist. Instead, he continued home, his thoughts troubled by the shadows of the day to come, and the impossible choice that waited there. Behind him, the widow remained at her silent post, a dark sentinel against the endless white of winter. The town hall of redemption had never felt smaller than it did that morning. Thomas sat alone at the back, watching as the room filled with familiar faces. Miners, shopkeepers, farmers from the outlying areas, all curious to witness the resolution of what had become the town's most pressing scandal. Judge Ezekiel Parker presided from behind a makeshift bench, his silver beard and piercing eyes giving him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet ready to pass judgment. Beside him sat the 5 members of the town council, including Dr. Walsh, whose grim expression suggested he'd already made up his mind. "This meeting will come to order," the judge announced, silencing the murmurs with one sharp rap of his gavel. "We're here to address the matter of Jacob Spencer's property, his widow's welfare, and the responsibility of Mr. Thomas Cole in this situation." Thomas stiffened. Responsibility. As if Jacob's death had been his doing. The door at the back of the hall opened, and the crowd parted as Margaret Spencer entered. Up close, she was not what Thomas expected. The severe black dress remained, but her copper hair, loosened from its usual tight arrangement, fell in waves past her shoulders. Her face, though pale, showed a quiet dignity rather than the bitterness he'd anticipated. "Mrs. Spencer," Judge Parker acknowledged with a nod. "Please, join us at the front." She moved through the crowd without looking at anyone, her back straight as a ramrod. When she passed Thomas, her eyes flickered to his face, not with hatred, as he'd feared, but with a cool assessment that left him feeling strangely exposed. "Now then," the judge continued once Margaret was seated, "let's get to the heart of this matter. Mr. Cole's gold strike last October has been officially surveyed and recorded. The claim encompasses not only his original stake, but also portions of adjacent land, including the 10 acres upon which stands the Spencer homestead." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas fought the urge to defend himself. They all knew the mining laws. A vein could be followed regardless of surface property lines. It wasn't his fault the gold ran beneath Spencer land, according to territorial law. Judge Parker went on. "Mr. Cole has legal right to extract minerals from this entire claim. However, this creates the untenable situation of Mrs. Spencer living on land, now effectively controlled by Mr. Cole." Margaret sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap. Not once did she turn to look at the crowd or at Thomas. Further complicating matters is the unfortunate death of Jacob Spencer while disputing this very boundary, the judge said, his voice dropping solemnly. "While the sheriff's investigation concluded the death was accidental, the timing has cast a shadow over Mr. Cole's otherwise legal claim." Now Thomas did stand, unable to contain himself any longer. "I had nothing to do with that accident." Judge Parker fixed him with a stern glare. "No one is suggesting murder, Mr. Cole. Sit down." "Aren't they?" Thomas challenged, looking around. "The room. Isn't that why we're really here? Because half the town thinks I frightened Jacob's horse deliberately so I could steal his land?" "Thomas!" Sheriff Holden warned from near the door. "No, let him speak." Margaret's voice cut through the tension, surprising everyone. It was the first time most of them had heard her speak since the funeral. "I'd like to hear what Mr. Cole has to say about my husband's death." All eyes turned to Thomas. The anger that had propelled him to his feet suddenly left him, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of Margaret's steady gaze. "I argued with your husband," he admitted quietly. "We both said things we shouldn't have. But when his horse threw him, I was the first one to reach him. I tried to help." "Not hard enough," someone muttered from the crowd. "That's enough," Judge Parker commanded. We're not here to retry a settled matter. We're here to determine a path forward." He straightened. "His papers. After consultation with the town council and consideration of local custom, I propose the following resolution. A marriage of convenience between Mr. Cole and Mrs. Spencer." Though Thomas had been expecting it, the words still hit him like a physical blow. He looked to Margaret, expecting outrage to match his own, but her expression remained unreadable. "Such a union," the judge continued, "would resolve the property dispute, provide Mrs. Spencer with security, and allow Mr. Cole to continue his mining operation without the cloud of controversy that currently surrounds him." "And if we refuse?" Thomas asked. Judge Parker's eyebrows rose. "Then I'll have no choice but to place an injunction on your mining operation until ownership of the disputed property can be determined by a higher court. That process could take years, during which time the gold you've discovered would remain in the ground." A clever trap, Thomas realized, his own success used against him. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but finding none. Even Barney, who'd slipped in late and stood near the back, avoided his gaze. "Mrs. Spencer," the judge turned to Margaret, "you've heard the proposal. Do you have anything to say?" For a long moment she remained silent, and Thomas found himself holding his breath. Then she rose, smoothing her black skirts with pale hands. "My husband has been dead 3 months, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "In that time I've respected his memory and mourned his loss, but Jacob left me with nothing except debts and a house that apparently sits on another man's gold." Her eyes, grey as the winter sky, finally met Thomas's directly. "I have no desire to remarry, certainly not to a stranger, but neither do I wish to be a burden on this community's charity." She turned back to the judge. "If Mr. Cole agrees to this arrangement, I will accept it on one condition, that it remains a marriage in name only. I will keep his house and manage his affairs as appropriate. But there will be no—" She hesitated, the faintest color touching her cheeks. "No expectations of a more personal nature." Thomas stared at her, astonished. This woman, who by all rights should hate him, was negotiating the terms of their forced union with the practical detachment of a business arrangement. "Mr. Cole?" Judge Parker prompted. "Your response?" "Your response?" Every instinct told him to refuse, to walk out and take his chances with the courts. But looking at Margaret Spencer's composed face, he felt a reluctant admiration for her pragmatism in an impossible situation. "I agree to the marriage," he said, finally the words tasting bitter on his tongue, "and to Mrs. Spencer's condition." A collective sigh rippled through the crowd. Relief from some, disappointment from others who'd hoped for more drama. "Then it's settled," Judge Parker declared. "The ceremony will take place tomorrow morning here in the town hall. I'll preside myself before returning to Carson City." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas found himself face to face with Margaret Spencer for the first time. "Mr. Cole," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Mrs. Spencer," he returned awkwardly, "I want you to know that I truly didn't—" "What's done is done," she interrupted. "Jacob was a proud man who sometimes let anger cloud his judgment. His death was a tragedy, but dwelling on it serves neither of us." She adjusted her shawl with precise movements. "I'll bring only personal belongings to your home. Everything else can be sold to settle Jacob's debts." Thomas blinked at her practicality. "There's no need. I have enough money now to—" "I won't start this arrangement in your debt," she said firmly. "Jacob's obligations are mine to resolve." Before he could respond, Dr. Walsh approached, his round face serious beneath his balding head. "Mrs. Spencer, a word, if you please." He glanced at Thomas. "In private." She nodded and followed the doctor to a corner, leaving Thomas to wonder. What medical concern required such discretion? Margaret's face remained impassive as the doctor spoke, though once she glanced back at Thomas with an expression he couldn't interpret. Sheriff Holden clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Could have gone worse. Could have not happened at all if you'd warned me earlier," Thomas muttered. "Would it have made a difference?" The sheriff's eyes were knowing. "You're not the first man to marry for reasons other than love, Tom. And she's a good woman by all accounts, educated, capable, and likely despises me." "Didn't sound that way to me," Sheriff Holden observed. "Sounded like a woman making the best of bad circumstances, just like you." Thomas watched as Margaret concluded her conversation with the doctor, her face pale but determined as she walked toward the exit. "Tomorrow at 10, then," she said as she passed him, not slowing her steps. "Tomorrow," Thomas agreed to her retreating. Back, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wedding, if it could be called that, was as austere as the bride's black dress. No flowers softened the town hall's wooden walls. No music played as Margaret walked alone to stand beside Thomas before Judge Parker. The few witnesses included Sheriff Holden, Dr. Walsh and Barney, who had closed the saloon for an hour out of respect for the occasion. "Do you, Thomas James Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Thomas said, the words falling like stones into the silent room. "And do you, Margaret Ann Spencer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Margaret's voice was steady. "I do." "Then, by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Parker closed his Bible with a snap. "Mr. Cole, you may kiss your bride." Thomas hesitated, remembering Margaret's condition. Her eyes met his, challenging yet somehow vulnerable beneath her composure. Gently he took her gloved hand and pressed his lips to it, a compromise that brought a faint look of surprise to her face. "Well, that's done," Judge Parker declared, gathering his papers. "Sheriff, you'll file the certificate?" "Yes, Your Honor." The small group dispersed quickly, leaving the newlyweds in awkward silence. "I've arranged for your things to be moved." "To my cabin," Thomas said finally. "It's not as large as your house, but it's solid. We can discuss building something more suitable in the spring." "Your cabin will be adequate," Margaret replied. "I don't require much space." The ride to Thomas's home passed in silence. The cabin, nestled against a hillside with a view of the main entrance, was indeed small but well built. A bedroom, a main room combining kitchen and living space, and a lean-to at the back, housing tools and supplies. Margaret surveyed it with an appraising eye that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "I'll sleep in the main room," Thomas offered, gesturing to a worn armchair. "The bedroom is yours." "That won't be necessary. I can make a bed out here, I insist." His tone brooked no argument. "My mother would rise from her grave and haunt me if I let my wife sleep on the floor while I took the bed." Something like amusement flickered in Margaret's eyes. "Very well, Mr. Cole." "Thomas," he corrected. "At least when we're alone. Seems strange otherwise." She nodded. "Thomas, then, and you may call me Margaret." The day settled into an uneasy routine. Margaret unpacked her few belongings while Thomas checked on the mine. When he returned, he found the cabin transformed, not with feminine touches as he might have expected, but with an order that had been lacking before. His books, previously scattered wherever he'd last read them, now stood neatly on shelves. The dishes that normally piled in the dry sink had been washed and put away. Most surprising was the smell of fresh bread that filled the small space. "You am baked?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. "I thought we should have a proper meal," Margaret replied, not looking up from the stew she stirred. It seemed a better use of time than dwelling on our circumstances. That first dinner as husband and wife was a quiet affair, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional comment about the food or weather. Thomas found himself studying Margaret when she wasn't looking. The precise way she ate, the graceful movement of her hands, the shadow of her lashes against her cheeks in the lamplight. "You're staring," she said suddenly, setting down her spoon. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, embarrassed at being caught. "It's just, I know almost nothing about you." "What would you like to know?" he considered. "How did you meet Jacob?" A shadow crossed her face. "My father was a professor at a college in Pennsylvania. Jacob was a former student who'd made his fortune in lumber. When father's health failed, Jacob offered marriage and financial security." "You didn't love him?" "I respected him," she answered. Carefully, "Jacob was ambitious and determined, but love—" She shook her head. "That's a luxury some women can't afford." Thomas digested this. "And children. Jacob mentioned once that you couldn't—" "No," she cut him off, her voice suddenly brittle. "I cannot have children. Dr. Walsh confirmed it years ago after several disappointments. If that knowledge changes your view of our arrangement—" "It doesn't," Thomas assured her quickly. "I only asked because a barren wife is a burden some men find difficult to bear," she finished for him. "Jacob certainly did." The pain beneath her matter-of-fact tone caught Thomas by surprise. "I'm not Jacob," he said quietly. Margaret's eyes met his, searching. "No," she agreed after a moment. "You're not." You're not. The weeks following the wedding settled into an unexpected rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn each day, working his claim until dusk with a determined focus that kept his mind from dwelling on the strange situation he'd found himself in. Margaret turned his sparse cabin into something resembling a home, not with feminine frills as he'd feared, but with practical improvements that even he had to admit made life more comfortable. February gave way to March, the brutal winter slowly loosening its grip on the mountains. As the snow began to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground, the town's initial fascination with the Cole marriage gradually faded in favor of new gossip. Thomas found the suspicious glances diminishing, though they never entirely disappeared. One evening, returning earlier than usual due to equipment problems at the mine, Thomas paused outside his own door. Through the window he could see Margaret seated at the table, her head bent over a book, copper hair gleaming in the lamplight. For a moment, the scene struck him with an unexpected feeling. Not quite happiness, but something like contentment. She looked up as he entered, quickly closing the volume before him. "You're back early," she observed, rising to take his coat. "Broken pump? Wilson's ordering a replacement from Carson City." Thomas glanced at the closed book. "What were you reading?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Nothing important." His curiosity piqued. Thomas reached for the book before she could move it. "Poetry?" he asked, surprised to find a slim volume of Wordsworth. "I wouldn't have guessed." "Jacob found it frivolous," Margaret admitted, taking the book back with gentle firmness. "He preferred practical reading, newspapers, agricultural guides." "And what do you prefer?" She hesitated, as if unused to being asked her opinion. "I enjoy poetry and novels when I can find them. My father had an extensive library before we had to sell it." Thomas crossed to the small shelf where his own books were kept. "Not much of a collection, but you're welcome to anything here. The Dickens is decent, though the last few pages are missing." Margaret looked genuinely surprised by the offer. "Thank you." As she examined the shelf, Thomas found himself watching her again, a habit he couldn't seem to break. In these unguarded moments, when she thought herself unobserved, the rigid composure she maintained slipped just enough to reveal glimpses of a different woman beneath the widow's black dress and careful reserve. "You know," he said impulsively, "you don't have to keep wearing mourning clothes. It's been over 4 months since Jacob passed," her hand stilled on the spine of a book. "The traditional mourning period is a year. Seems to me we've both made enough concessions to tradition lately." When she didn't respond, he added, "Besides, black drains the color from your face. You look like you haven't seen sunlight in months." Margaret turned, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "I wasn't aware you'd noticed my appearance, Mr. Cole." "Thomas," he reminded her, "and I'd have to be blind not to notice I'm living with a ghost." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile before she controlled it. "Perhaps you're right. I have a blue dress I could alter." "Good," Thomas nodded, oddly pleased by this small victory. "Wear it to the Founders' Day celebration next week." "I hadn't planned to attend. Neither had I, but Barney insists, says people are still talking, and the best way to silence them is to appear together in public." He ran a hand through his hair. "Apparently our arrangement isn't convincing enough." Something changed in Margaret's expression, a slight withdrawal he couldn't interpret. "Very well, if it will help make our situation more acceptable to the town." That night, as Thomas tried to find a comfortable position on his makeshift bed in the main room, he found himself thinking about his accidental wife. 4 weeks of marriage, and she remained largely a mystery. She spoke little of her past, asked nothing of his, maintained the polite distance they'd agreed upon. Yet sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression that suggested she was trying to solve a puzzle. The Founders' Day celebration brought the entire population of Redemption to the town square. Tables laden with food lined the edges, while a small band played lively tunes on a makeshift stage. Thomas and Margaret arrived just as the festivities were getting underway, her hand resting lightly on his arm. True to her word, Margaret had changed from her black dress to one of deep blue that transformed her appearance. With her copper hair arranged more softly around her face and a touch of color in her cheeks, she drew appreciative glances from several men and speculative looks from their wives. "Everyone's staring," she murmured, as they made their way toward the food tables. "Let them," Thomas replied, finding himself unexpectedly proud to be seen with her. "You look beautiful." Her steps faltered slightly, and she glanced up at him with that now familiar, puzzled expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dr. Walsh intercepted them before they could reach the tables, his round face serious despite the festive atmosphere. "Mrs. Cole, a moment if you please." He glanced at Thomas. "In private, if you don't mind." Thomas felt Margaret's hand tighten briefly on his arm. "Anything you need to discuss with my wife can be said in front of me," he heard himself say, surprising them both. The doctor frowned. "It's a medical matter, Mr. Cole. Hardly appropriate." "It's all right," Margaret interrupted. "I'd prefer Thomas to hear whatever concerns you have, Doctor." Walsh looked between them, clearly taken aback by this unexpected unity. "Very well. I wanted to check on your condition. The symptoms you described at our last meeting have improved," Margaret said quickly. "I've been following your advice about rest and nutrition." Good. The doctor didn't look entirely convinced. "Still, I'd like you to come by for another examination next week, just to be certain." After he left, Thomas turned to Margaret with concern. "You've been ill? Why didn't you tell me?" "It was nothing serious," she assured him. "Just fatigue and some stomach upset, probably from adjusting to the altitude." Before Thomas could press further, Sheriff Holden approached with his wife, a plump, pleasant woman who immediately engaged Margaret in conversation about the Ladies' Aid Society. As the women talked, the sheriff drew Thomas aside. "Seems you two are getting on better than expected," he observed, watching as Mrs. Holden actually coaxed a smile from Margaret. "We've come to an understanding," Thomas replied neutrally. "Glad to hear it." The sheriff lowered his voice. "Though, there's still talk, you know, about Jacob's death being too convenient for you both." Thomas stiffened. "What are you saying?" "Nothing." Holden held up his hands. "Just warning you that some folks think you and Margaret might have planned things together. That maybe you knew each other before Jacob's accident." "That's ridiculous," Thomas hissed. "I barely spoke to her before the wedding." "I know that. But the way you two looked just now, approaching the square together." The sheriff shrugged. Let's just say you make a handsome couple for two people who supposedly can't stand each other. The accusation, however veiled, left Thomas seething as they rejoined the women. Margaret must have sensed his change in mood, for she looked at him questioningly. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," he muttered. "Just remembering why I avoid these gatherings." The rest of the afternoon passed in strained politeness as they circulated among the townspeople. Thomas found himself increasingly aware of the speculative glances and whispered comments that followed them. Worse, he became uncomfortably conscious of Margaret beside him. The scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the graceful way she moved, the rare smile that transformed her serious face when someone said something amusing. By the time they returned home, twilight was settling over the mountains, bathing the cabin in golden light. Thomas held the door open for Margaret, watching as she removed her shawl and hung it carefully on a hook. "People seem to think we planned Jacob's death together," he said abruptly, unable to contain the words any longer. "That we were involved before the accident." Margaret went very still. "That's absurd. Is it?" The injustice of the accusation, combined with his confusion about his growing awareness of her, made his voice harsher than intended. "You didn't seem particularly grief-stricken at the town hall meeting or the wedding," color flooded her face, "because I refused to make a public spectacle of my sorrow. Jacob was my husband for 8 years, Mr. Cole. I mourned him privately, as was proper, and our marriage of convenience, was that proper too?" "What would you have had me do?" she demanded, her composure cracking at last. "Refuse and be left destitute. Allow this town to support me through charity while you grew rich from gold that ran beneath my home?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "No, of course not. You just what? Regret our arrangement?" Her voice had taken on a bitter edge. "Rest assured, Mr. Cole, I'm well aware this isn't what either of us would have chosen. But unless you're planning to divorce me and face the scandal that would bring, we're bound to each other now." "I'm not planning to divorce you," Thomas said, the thought having never occurred to him until she mentioned it. "I'm just tired of being looked at like we committed murder together." Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, her anger fading as quickly as it had flared. "As am I, but there's nothing we can do except continue as we have been. In time, the talk will fade." Thomas studied her face, struck by the weariness in her eyes. "You look pale. Are you sure you're feeling well?" "Just tired," she admitted. "It's been a long day." "Go rest," he said, his tone gentler now. "I'll make tea." She looked at him with surprise, then nodded and moved toward the bedroom. At the door, she paused. "Thomas, I never thanked you properly for taking me in. Whatever your reasons, you've been kind, more than Jacob ever was." Before he could respond, she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Thomas to stare at the closed door and wonder what kind of man Jacob Spencer had really been, and why the comparison left him feeling strangely inadequate despite the apparent compliment. The following week brought an early spring storm that kept Thomas confined to the cabin, unable to work his claim due to the dangerous conditions. For the first time since their marriage, he and Margaret spent entire days in each other's company, an experience that proved both uncomfortable and revealing. He discovered she had a quick mind and a dry wit that emerged when she forgot to maintain her reserve. She learned he could discuss literature with surprising insight for a man who'd spent most of his adult life prospecting in the wilderness. They played chess in the evenings, Margaret proving a formidable opponent who showed no mercy in exploiting his mistakes. "Checkmate," she announced on the third night, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Again?" Thomas groaned, studying the board with disbelief. "That's 3 in a row. Where did you learn to play like this?" "My father taught me," she replied, resetting the pieces. He believed women's minds were just as capable as men's, despite what society might say. He educated me alongside his male students until my mother objected. She didn't approve of educated women. Margaret's hands stilled on the chess pieces. She believed too much learning made a woman unmarriageable, that men prefer wives who don't challenge their intellectual superiority. A shadow crossed her face. She was right in Jacob's case. He liked to remind me that my education was wasted on a barren wife who couldn't even produce the sons my father wanted. The bitterness in her voice stirred something protective in Thomas. Your husband sounds like he was a fool. Her eyes widened at his bluntness. Jacob was complex, ambitious but frustrated by setbacks. When he realized I couldn't give him children, something changed in him. He became obsessed with leaving a legacy through property wealth, anything that would outlast him. Is that why he fought so hard over the boundary with my claim? She nodded slowly. That land represented his future. When you found gold there. She trailed off, then added quietly, he wasn't always cruel, just disappointed in what our marriage had become. Thomas thought about this as they continued their game in silence. He'd spent his life seeking gold, believing wealth would bring him happiness, security, respect. Jacob had sought the same, despite already having a wife many men would envy. Margaret, he said suddenly, do you ever regret not having children? The chess piece in her hand, a knight, clattered to the table. What kind of question is that? An honest one, Thomas replied. I've wondered myself sometimes. If Emily had lived and we'd had a family. He hadn't spoken his former fiancée's name aloud in years, and it felt strange on his tongue. Margaret was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was barely audible. Every day, she whispered. Every single day, every single day. April brought a decisive thaw to redemption. Melting snow turned the streets to mud, and the first green shoots pushed through the softening earth around Thomas's cabin. With spring came renewed activity at the mine, forcing Thomas to hire additional workers to keep pace with the expanding operation. Margaret still hadn't answered his question about children from that chess night, but something had shifted between them. A door cracked open that neither seemed ready to push further. One morning, Thomas lingered at breakfast, watching Margaret move about the kitchen. The blue dress she now wore regularly suited her far better than morning black, bringing colour to her cheeks and highlighting the auburn undertones in her hair. I'll be late tonight, he said, reluctantly rising from the table. Wilson thinks we've hit a new vein. Margaret nodded, handing him a packed lunch. When their fingers brushed, neither pulled away immediately. Be careful, she said softly. The shaft timbers were creaking yesterday. Thomas blinked, surprised by her concern. I'll check them first thing. At the door, he paused. There's a package for you on the wagon. Ordered it from Carson City. Her puzzled expression followed him as he hurried down the path toward the mine entrance, a strange lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the brightening spring. A day Margaret found the package after Thomas left, a wooden crate addressed to her. Inside, nestled in straw, lay a dozen books. Austen, Shelley, Bronte, Eliot, authors she had mentioned loving during their chess games. A small note simply read, "To replace your father's library. Tea." She pressed a book to her chest, eyes closed against sudden tears. Such an extravagant gift, yet somehow perfectly suited to her. It showed an attentiveness she hadn't expected, from this man who'd been forced to marry her. Later that afternoon, as Margaret arranged her new books on a shelf Thomas had built, a sharp knock at the door interrupted her. She opened it to find Sheriff Holden's wife Martha, holding a basket and wearing an expression of determined friendliness. "I thought it was past time we had a proper visit," Martha announced, bustling inside without waiting for an invitation. "Sheriff says your husband won't be back till late, so I brought supper." Margaret had limited experience with the sheriff's wife, having kept to herself both during her marriage to Jacob and after. But Martha's straightforward manner was difficult to resist. "That's very kind," she said, taking the basket and peeking inside to find a still warm chicken pie. "I was just arranging some books." Martha's eyes widened at the new collection. "My goodness, where did those come from?" Thomas ordered them. Margaret couldn't keep a note of wonder from her voice. "A gift." The older woman's expression shifted into something more calculating. "Well now, isn't that interesting?" She settled herself at the table. "Everyone's noticed the change in you both lately. Thomas actually smiled at the general store yesterday. People have too much time for gossip." "In this town," Margaret replied, busying herself with plates and cutlery. "Perhaps, but seeing you at Founder's Day, looking at each other when you thought no one was watching." Martha smiled knowingly. "It didn't look like a marriage of convenience to me." Heat crept into Margaret's cheeks. "Our arrangement is evolving, as it should." Martha leaned forward. "Now tell me honestly, are you feeling any better? Dr. Walsh mentioned you've been unwell." "Just tired," Margaret hedged. "The mountain air takes months to adjust to, not nearly half a year." Martha's eyes were kind but shrewd. "And it doesn't usually cause the kind of sickness that comes in the morning." Margaret froze, a plate halfway to the table. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing that hasn't crossed your mind, I'd wager." Martha's voice softened. "When was your last monthly?" The plate clattered to the table. "That's impossible. I can't. Dr. Walsh said years ago that I couldn't conceive." "Doctors can be wrong, especially about women's matters." Martha stood and gently guided Margaret to a chair. "The signs are there for anyone with eyes to see. The glow in your skin despite your fatigue. The fullness in your face. The way you unconsciously rest your hand here." She gestured to Margaret's midsection. "When you're thinking." "But Jacob and I tried for 8 years," Margaret whispered. "Nothing, not even once." Martha patted her hand. "Sometimes the seed and the soil just don't match, dear. It doesn't mean either is barren on its own." Barren. The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret shook her head violently. "Even if you're right and you're not. Thomas and I haven't—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her face flaming. "Our marriage isn't like that." Martha's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "You mean you haven't consummated—" "It was part of our agreement," Margaret said stiffly. "A marriage in name only." "I see." Martha looked thoughtful. "Well, that certainly complicates matters." "There are no matters to complicate," Margaret insisted. "I'm not with child. I can't be." But that night, alone in her bedroom, Margaret finally allowed herself to consider the possibility she'd been avoiding for weeks. Her symptoms matched those she'd observed in other women. The fatigue, the nausea, the strange aversions to certain foods. She'd attributed them to stress and adjustment. But what if? She placed a trembling hand on her abdomen. If Martha was right, there could be only one explanation, and it wasn't Thomas Cole, Jacob. But that was nearly impossible too. In their final months together, Jacob had barely looked at her, their marriage a hollow shell maintained for appearances. Any relations had been infrequent and perfunctory, his disappointment in her barrenness creating a wall between them. Still, if by some miracle she had conceived before Jacob's death, what would happen when the child came too early to be Thomas's, but too late to be believably Jacob's? The scandal would destroy them both, and if she wasn't pregnant, if this was just another cruel, false hope like the ones she'd experienced in her first marriage, the disappointment might break her. Sleep eluded her, and when Thomas returned home, past midnight, she listened to his quiet movements in the main room, torn between dread and a strange, fragile hope. The next morning, Thomas sensed the change in her immediately. "Something wrong?" Margaret avoided his eyes. "Martha Holden visited yesterday." "Ah." He poured coffee into his mug. Sheriff mentioned she'd been planning to check on you, said something about the Ladies' Aid Society wanting you to join. It wasn't about that. Margaret took a deep breath. She suggested that I might be, that is, she thinks I could be. Thomas waited, an unreadable expression on his face. She believes I'm with child, Margaret finally said, the words rushing out, which is impossible, of course. Dr. Walsh confirmed years ago that I couldn't bear children. The coffee mug froze halfway to Thomas's lips. I see. I'm telling you this because people will talk once Martha shares her suspicions, Margaret continued hurriedly, and because you should know I've never broken our agreement. This isn't. She gestured vaguely between them. We haven't. I'm aware, Thomas said quietly, setting down his mug. What does Dr. Walsh say? I haven't consulted him about this specifically, but he knows my history. Thomas studied her face. Perhaps you should see him today, to put the matter to rest. His calmness unsettled her. Aren't you concerned about what people will think? If Martha's right and she isn't, the timing would cause speculation about, she couldn't finish, about whether the child is Jacob's or mine, Thomas completed for her. Yes, I understand the implications. And that doesn't trouble you? A strange expression crossed his face. What troubles me is that you're clearly upset. Whatever the doctor says, we'll deal with it together. Margaret stared at him. This man who had been a stranger 3 months ago and was now offering support she hadn't expected. Together, she repeated softly. Dr. Walsh's office sat above the apothecary, a small space that smelled perpetually of camphor and carbolic acid. The doctor looked up from his desk as Margaret entered, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Mrs. Cole, I wasn't expecting you until next week. I need your professional opinion, Margaret said, removing her bonnet. Martha Holden visited yesterday and suggested something concerning. The doctor's expression grew serious. Please, sit down. Margaret perched on the edge of the examination chair, hands twisted in her lap. She believes I'm with child. Walsh's face remained carefully neutral. I see. And what do you believe? That it's impossible, Margaret replied firmly. You yourself told me years ago, after the last miscarriage, that I would never carry a child to term, that something was wrong inside me. The doctor sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them, a habit Margaret remembered from her previous consultations. Medical science is imperfect, Mrs. Cole. Sometimes we make pronouncements based on the evidence before us, only to be proven wrong by nature's persistence. A flicker of hope quickly suppressed. Are you saying I could be pregnant? I'm saying we should examine the possibility. He replaced his spectacles. When was your last monthly cycle? Margaret calculated backward, the realization making her light-headed. Nearly 3 months ago, before Jacob died. Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. And you've experienced the usual symptoms? Morning sickness, fatigue, tenderness? Yes to all, she whispered, but I attributed them to grief and adjustment. Understandable. The doctor stood. I'll need to examine you properly to confirm. The examination was brief, but thorough. When Dr. Walsh finally stepped back, his expression was solemn. Mrs. Cole, Margaret, I believe Martha Holden's assessment was correct. You are with child, approximately 3 months along by my estimation. The room seemed to spin around her. That's not possible. You said I was wrong, he admitted quietly. It happens more often than doctors like to acknowledge. Your previous difficulties may have been due to various factors: stress, poor nutrition, incompatibility. Incompatibility, Margaret echoed. Sometimes, the doctor said carefully. A woman who cannot conceive with one man may find success with another. The mysteries of reproduction are still largely that, mysteries. The implication hung in the air between them. Margaret clutched the edge of the examination table. Dr. Walsh, I need to be absolutely clear. My husband, Thomas, and I have not been intimate. If I am indeed carrying a child, it can only be Jacob's." The doctor's expression shifted subtly. "I see." He made a note in his record book. "That would mean conception occurred shortly before Mr. Spencer's death." "Yes, and you're certain about the nature of your current marriage?" Heat flooded Margaret's face. "Completely certain. Very well." He closed his book with a snap. "Then we're looking at a late October birth. Nearly 9 months after your marriage to Mr. Cole, but also 9 months after Mr. Spencer's death. A coincidence that will certainly raise eyebrows in a town like Redemption." Margaret felt ill, for reasons that had nothing to do with her condition. "What am I going to do?" "First, take care of your health," Dr. Walsh advised, his professional manner returning. "Rest when needed, eat well, avoid exertion. Second," he hesitated, "consider discussing the situation frankly with your husband. Mr. Cole seems a reasonable man." "He knows I've come to see you," Margaret admitted. "He said we would handle whatever comes together." The doctor looked surprised. "Then perhaps you're more fortunate in your second marriage than you realize." Thomas was waiting outside the apothecary when Margaret emerged. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "Let's not discuss it here," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Too many eyes." The walk home passed in tense silence. Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople they passed. Had Martha Holden already shared her suspicions? How long before the whole town was counting months on their fingers and whispering behind closed doors? Once inside the cabin, Thomas hung his hat and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What did Walsh say?" Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. He confirmed it. "A child, due in late October." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Jacob's child. It must be," she whispered. "There's no other possibility." He paced to the window, looking out at the mine entrance visible on the hillside. "The timing will raise questions." "Questions?" Margaret gave a brittle laugh. "It will cause a scandal. A child born 9 months after our wedding, conceived around the time of Jacob's death, when you and I supposedly had never spoken. The town already half believes we conspired to kill him. This will confirm every suspicion." Thomas turned, his face troubled but calm. "Then we'll leave." "What?" "The mine is producing well. I've had offers from Eastern investors to buy the claim. We could go somewhere new. Denver, San Francisco, even back east if you prefer. Somewhere no one knows our history." Margaret stared at him, stunned by the simple solution. "You would do that? Leave everything you've built here?" "What I've built is just a hole in the ground," Thomas said with a shrug. "Gold is gold, whether I dig it up myself or sell the rights to someone else. But this is your home. A cabin and a saloon stool aren't much of a home." He sat across from her, his eyes serious. "I came west because there was nothing to keep. Me in Ohio after Emily died. I stayed in Redemption because it was as good a place as any to search for gold. Now I've found it, and the only thing tying me here is—" He stopped abruptly. "Is what?" Margaret prompted, her heart suddenly racing. Thomas looked away. "Is a town full of people who think the worst of us both. Why stay?" Something in his evasion made Margaret push further. "Were you going to say something else?" "It doesn't matter." He stood again, restless. "What matters is deciding what's best for you and the child." The child. The reality of it washed over her again. The miracle she'd given up hoping for years ago, now growing inside her despite all medical predictions. Jacob's child, the heir he'd desperately wanted but never lived to see. "I need to think," she said, rising unsteadily. "This is all happening so fast." Thomas crossed to her in 2 strides, catching her elbow as she swayed. "You should rest." The concern in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to show such weakness. "I'm fine, just overwhelmed." His hand lingered on her arm, warm and steadying. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it. If you want to stay and face the gossip, we will. If you want to leave, we'll go wherever you choose." Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why would you upend your life for a child that isn't yours, for a wife you never wanted? Thomas's eyes held hers, something unspoken swimming in their depths, because right now you have no one else, and neither do I. His voice dropped lower. "And because I know what it's like to face the world alone." He released her arm and stepped back. "Take all the time you need to decide." But the decision was taken out of their hands the very next day. Margaret was in the garden behind the cabin, planting vegetables in the freshly turned soil, when she heard approaching hoofbeats. She looked up to see Sheriff Holden dismounting. At their front gate, his expression grim. "Mrs. Cole," he greeted her, removing his hat, "is your husband at home?" "At the mine," she replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "Is something wrong?" "I'd rather discuss it with both of you." He glanced toward the mine entrance, visible up the slope. "Important enough to interrupt his work, I'm afraid." Something in his tone sent a chill through her. "I'll get him." Thomas returned with her 10 minutes later, his face concerned beneath a layer of mine dust. The sheriff waited in the main room, declining Margaret's offer of coffee. "What's this about, Bob?" Thomas asked without preamble. Sheriff Holden's eyes flicked between them. "I've just had a troubling conversation with Dr. Walsh. He came to me with concerns." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "About my condition, among other things." The sheriff looked distinctly uncomfortable. "He said you're expecting a child." "That's our private business," Thomas said firmly. "Ordinarily, I'd agree. But the doctor raised a specific issue that, as an officer of the law, I can't ignore." Holden removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "He says the child must have been conceived before Jacob Spencer's death, given the timing and the nature of your marriage." Margaret sank into a chair, mortification washing over her. "He had no right to share that information." "Maybe not," the sheriff conceded, "but he did, and now there are questions that need answers." Thomas moved to stand beside Margaret's chair, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the sheriff. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve the suspicious death of a man, followed by his widow marrying the prime suspect and now carrying a child that creates a very convenient family unit." Holden's voice was regretful but firm. "People are already talking, Tom. This news will make things worse. This news will make things worse. You know, I had nothing to do with Jacob's accident," Thomas said, anger edging his voice. "What I know and what I can prove are different matters." The sheriff sighed. "Look, I'm trying to help you both. Dr. Walsh came to me privately, but it won't stay private. Martha already has suspicions about the pregnancy, and you know how this town works." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, her hands instinctively covering her midsection. "Leave," Holden said bluntly. "Sell the mine, take the money, and start fresh somewhere else." Before Judge Parker gets involved again, Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're running us out of town. I'm giving you a chance to avoid ugly accusations that could lead to a trial." The sheriff put his hat back on. "The eastbound stage leaves tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you be on it." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't believe either of you killed Jacob. But what I believe won't matter much when the rumors really start flying." After he left, Margaret and Thomas stood in stunned silence. Finally, Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "It seems our decision has been made for us," he said quietly. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "This is all my fault." "If I weren't—" "Don't," Thomas interrupted gently. "This child is a miracle you never thought you'd have. We won't let gossip taint that. But you're mine. Can be sold by telegram from Denver." He squeezed her hands. "We'll need to pack, only. What's necessary? Leave the furniture, take personal items and valuables." Margaret marvelled at his practical approach, the absence of recrimination. "You're not angry at you for carrying a child?" Thomas shook his head. "No. At this town and their eagerness to think the worst? Yes." He released her hands and stood. "I'll go make arrangements now. We'll leave at first light." As he strode toward the door, Margaret called after him. "Thomas, thank you." He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "There's nothing to thank me for, not yet." The night passed in a flurry of packing and planning. Thomas returned from town with stage tickets, shipping arrangements for their larger possessions, and news that the mining company in Denver had expressed immediate interest in his claim. "They're sending a representative next week," he explained as they sorted through books, deciding which to take immediately and which to ship later. "We'll be well settled in a hotel by then." Margaret folded a dress into her trunk. "What will we do after? In Denver, I mean." "Whatever we choose." Thomas carefully wrapped the chess set they'd played with so many nights. "Buy a house, perhaps a business. I've always thought a bookshop might be pleasant." The casual way he included her in these future plans struck Margaret deeply. "And the child?" Thomas's hands stilled on the carved chess pieces. "The child will need a father," he said carefully. "If you'll permit it, I would be honored to fill that role." Margaret's breath caught. "Even though it's Jacob's? A child isn't defined by blood alone." Thomas placed the wrapped chess set in a crate, not meeting her eyes. "My stepfather was more of a parent to me than my blood father ever was. Family is what we make it." There it was again, that unexpected understanding, that willingness to accept circumstances others would find intolerable. Margaret watched him work, this man she'd married out of necessity and was now fleeing town with by choice. "I don't think I ever truly knew Jacob," she admitted suddenly. 8 years, and I never felt he saw me as anything but a means to an adverse status, then children he assumed I'd provide. When I couldn't, he looked through me rather than at me." She hesitated. "You're the first person who's actually seen me in a very long time." Thomas looked up then, his eyes intense. "I see you, Margaret. I have from the beginning." Something electric passed between them, a current of understanding that transcended their unusual circumstances. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by duty or necessity, but by genuine companionship, perhaps even something more. They worked through the night, speaking little, but moving in a strange harmony, as if they'd done this together many times before. By dawn, their essential belongings were packed, the cabin stripped of personal items, but still furnished for whoever might occupy it next. As the first light broke over the mountains, they stood in the doorway, looking back at the space that had witnessed their unlikely union. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked, offering his arm. Margaret nodded, taking it. "Yes, I believe I am." The stagecoach was already waiting when they reached town, their trunks loaded quickly by the driver. A small crowd had gathered, some out of curiosity, others to bid farewell. Dr. Walsh stood near the general store, his face troubled as he watched them. Martha Holden approached, pressing a package into Margaret's hands. "Provisions for the journey," she explained, then lowered her voice. "I never meant for this to happen when I visited you. The doctor had no right—" "It's all right," Margaret assured her. "Perhaps this is for the best." Sheriff Holden helped Thomas load the last of their bags. "I bought you as much time as I could," he said quietly. "Judge Parker will be back next month. Better you're well away by then." Thomas clasped his hand. "I understand. Thank you for the warning." As they climbed into the coach, Margaret caught sight of a familiar face at the edge of the crowd, Sarah from the dressmaker's shop, who'd altered her blue dress. The woman slipped forward, pressing something into Margaret's hand. "For the little one," she whispered, then stepped back quickly. Margaret glanced down to see a tiny knitted cap, white and soft. Tears pricked her eyes. Even amid the suspicion and judgment, there was kindness. The driver called for final boarding, and Thomas settled beside her on the hard leather seat. As the coach lurched forward, Margaret looked back at Redemption one last time, the town that had brought them together, through tragedy and forced them out through gossip. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, watching her face. Margaret turned from the window to meet his gaze, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach. "None," she replied with more certainty than she'd felt about anything in years. "And you?" "Only that we didn't leave sooner," he said, a rare smile transforming his face. "And on our own terms." The coach picked up speed as it left the town behind, rolling toward a future neither of them could have imagined 6 months earlier. As the buildings of Redemption disappeared around a bend, Margaret felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the burden of the past giving way to the promise of what lay ahead. Denver rose from the plains like a mirage, its brick buildings and church spires a stark contrast to the rugged mining camp they'd left behind. After 3 days of jolting travel, the stagecoach finally rolled to a stop outside the Occidental Hotel, an impressive 4-story structure that made Redemption's finest building look like a stable. Margaret stepped down with Thomas's assistance, her legs unsteady after the long journey. Though her condition remained invisible beneath her traveling dress, she felt the precious secret growing within her, a constant reminder of what they'd fled and what lay ahead. "I've booked us a suite," Thomas said, guiding her through the hotel's ornate lobby while porters followed with their trunks. 2 adjoining rooms. I thought you'd prefer the privacy." The consideration in this simple gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you." Their rooms overlooked a bustling street lined with shops and restaurants, a world away from their cabin on the mountainside. Margaret stood at the window, watching ladies in fashionable dresses stroll past with parasols tilted against the afternoon sun. "Different from Redemption," Thomas observed, coming to stand beside her. "In every possible way." She turned to him, suddenly uncertain. "What happens now?" "Now we rest. Tomorrow I meet with the mining company representative." He hesitated. "And then we decide what kind of life we want to build here." The "we" hung between them, no longer a marriage of convenience or necessity, but something neither could yet define. That evening, Thomas escorted Margaret to the hotel's dining room, its crystal chandeliers and linen tablecloths the height of luxury after months of simple cabin meals. Other guests nodded politely as they passed, seeing only a well-dressed couple with no hint of the scandal they'd left behind. "It's strange," Margaret said softly as they studied their menus. "To be among people who know nothing about us, no judgment, no whispers." "A fresh start," Thomas agreed. "We can be whoever we choose here." A waiter approached, and Thomas ordered for them both, a consideration Margaret had never experienced with Jacob, who'd always treated servers as beneath his notice. As they dined, Margaret found herself studying her husband's face in the warm glow of the gaslight, the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful expression in his eyes as he described his plans for meeting with the mining investors. When had this man, forced upon her by circumstance, become someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed? "You're staring," Thomas said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I'm trying to understand you," she admitted. "Most men would resent my situation, yet you've accepted it without complaint." Thomas set down his fork, considering his words carefully. "When Emily died, I thought I'd never have a family. The gold became everything, a purpose, a reason to keep going." His eyes met hers. "Now I find myself with something far more valuable, however unconventionally it came about." "We're hardly a family," Margaret protested softly. "Aren't we?" His gaze dropped briefly to her midsection. "A husband, a wife, a child on the way. The circumstances may be unusual, but the result is the same." The simple truth of his statement silenced her. They were indeed a family in form, if not yet in feeling. The realization should have frightened her, yet instead it brought an unexpected sense of peace. The following morning, Thomas left early for his meeting with the mining company, dressed in his finest suit. Margaret spent the day exploring the hotel and its immediate surroundings, marveling at the bustle of the growing city. When Thomas returned that afternoon, his expression told her everything before he spoke a word. "They've accepted," he announced, eyes bright with success. "Full purchase of the claim, with an advance payment today, and the remainder when their engineer completes the inspection." He placed a bank draft on the table between them, a sum that made Margaret's eyes widen. "This is just the advance?" she asked, stunned by the figure. Thomas nodded. "The full amount will be more than double this. We can buy a house, establish a business, provide for the child's future, whatever you want, whatever I want." The words caught in her throat. No one had asked what she wanted in so long. "Of course." He looked surprised by her reaction. "This is our future, Margaret. Your opinion matters as much as mine." That evening, as Denver's lights twinkled outside their window, they sat before the fire in Margaret's room, maps and real estate listings spread between them. Thomas had spent the afternoon gathering information about available properties, from elegant homes in fashionable neighborhoods to storefronts in the business district. "This one has a conservatory," he pointed out, showing her a listing for a brick house on a tree-lined street. "You mentioned once that you enjoyed gardening." "I did." Margaret couldn't recall sharing that detail. "At the Founders' Day celebration, you said your mother taught you about flowering plants before she decided it was more important for you to learn household management." The fact that he had remembered such a minor comment, made months ago amid the tension of their public appearance, struck her profoundly. "And this," Thomas continued, unaware of her reaction as he pulled another listing forward, "is a bookshop for sale. The owner is retiring to San Francisco. It comes with the inventory and living quarters above." Margaret studied the description. "A forgotten dream stirring to life." "I always imagined running a bookshop," she admitted. "My father's library was my favorite place as a child." "I know." Thomas's smile was gentle. "You told me during our chess games, you remember everything I say?" "Not everything," he demurred, "just the important things." Their eyes met over the scattered papers, and something shifted between them, a recognition of the partnership that had formed almost without their noticing during their months of forced proximity. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happens when the baby comes. People will count the months since our wedding. They'll know nothing," he interrupted firmly. "Babies come early sometimes, or late. No one here will question it because no one here knows when we married. We're simply Mr. and Mrs. Cole, arrived from the mining territories to start a new life." The simplicity of his solution calmed her racing thoughts. Here, they could indeed be whoever they chose, their history rewritten, their future uncharted. As the weeks passed, they settled into a new routine. Thomas purchased both the house with the conservatory and the bookshop, seeing no reason why they couldn't have both when funds were so plentiful. Each morning they walked together to the shop, arranging inventory and planning renovations. Each evening they returned to their home, discussing the day over dinner like any married couple. Yet they maintained their separate bedrooms, the unspoken agreement of their original arrangement holding firm despite the evolving nature of their relationship. Thomas never pressed, never assumed, allowing Margaret to set the pace of their growing closeness. By July, Margaret's condition could no longer be hidden. Her dresses, specially made by Denver's finest modiste, accommodated her changing figure, while her face glowed with the health that had eluded her during those early months of uncertainty. The bookshop opened to immediate success, its warm atmosphere and Margaret's knowledgeable recommendations drawing a loyal clientele. Thomas, to everyone's surprise, including his own, discovered a talent for business management. Their partnership, forged in necessity, flourished in freedom. One evening, as summer's heat gave way to the first cool breath of autumn, Margaret stood in her conservatory, tending to the exotic plants Thomas had ordered from Eastern nurseries. Her hand rested on her swollen abdomen, feeling the strong movements of the child within, movements that had begun just after they arrived in Denver, and now had become an everyday miracle. She heard Thomas enter but didn't turn, focused on the delicate leaves beneath her fingers. "The doctor came by the shop today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Asked if we'd like him to attend the birth when the time comes." Margaret stiffened. Her last experience with a doctor had been Walsh's betrayal of her confidence. "What did you tell him?" "That we'd discuss it." Thomas moved beside her, gently covering her hand on her belly with his own. The first time he'd touched her so intimately. "He seems competent, trained in Philadelphia." The sensation of his warm palm against hers, both feeling the life they now shared responsibility for, broke something open inside Margaret. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, alarmed. "Did I?" "Nothing's wrong," she managed through her tears. "Everything is just so different from what I expected, from what I thought possible." His hand remained steady on hers. "Different better or different worse?" "Better." She turned to face him fully. "So much better that sometimes I can't believe it's real, that I'll wake up back in redemption, in that empty house with nothing but Jacob's disappointment for company." Thomas's expression softened. With his free hand, he brushed a tear from her cheek, the gesture achingly tender. "This is real, Margaret. I promise you." But why? The question that had lingered unasked for months finally broke free. "Why have you done all this? Accepted a child that isn't yours, left everything you built, created this new life? You could have refused the council's demand and found another solution. You could have divorced me when we reached Denver. You could have—" "I couldn't," he interrupted gently. "Not once I knew you. Not once I saw who you truly are beneath the widow's black and the careful composure." His hand moved from her cheek to cup her face, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've watched you these past months. Your strength, your intelligence, your grace in impossible circumstances. How could I not care for you? How could I not want to build something real from our forced beginning?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Thomas, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I expect nothing. I just want you to understand why I've made the choices I have." But for once, Margaret didn't want to be cautious, didn't want to maintain the careful distance they'd established. Standing in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the life they'd built together and carrying the miracle neither had expected, she finally recognized the feeling that had been growing within her alongside the child. "I love you," she said simply. Thomas went very still, his eyes searching hers as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. "Not out of gratitude," she continued, needing him to understand. "Not out of obligation, but because of who you are, who we've become together." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm, radiant, full of promise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his mouth to hers. Their first kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. When they parted, Margaret saw in Thomas's eyes the same wonder she felt, that from such unlikely beginnings, such perfect joy could grow. "I love you too," he whispered against her lips. "Have for months now." The baby kicked strongly, as if responding to the surge of emotion between them. They both laughed, foreheads touching, hands still joined over the child that would bind them together regardless of its origin. "We should hire that doctor," Margaret said, making her decision. "But I want you with me when the baby comes, not waiting outside as men usually do, Thomas looked startled. "Are you certain? It's not customary?" "Nothing about us has been customary," she reminded him with a smile. "Why start now?" As autumn's gold touched Denver's trees, painting the city in colors to rival any miner's dream, Margaret and Thomas prepared for the child's arrival. The nursery, adjoining both their rooms, though Thomas rarely used his anymore, filled with furniture and toys purchased with the proceeds of the mine that had brought them together. The bookshop thrived under their joint management, becoming a gathering place for Denver's intellectual community. No one questioned their history or the timing of their child. They were simply the Coles, the handsome former miner and his educated wife, clearly devoted to each other and eagerly awaiting their firstborn. October arrived with crisper days and gold-tinged light that reminded Margaret of the sunsets over Redemption's mountains. As her time grew closer, she found herself thinking of the town they'd fled, wondering what stories still circulated about the widow who'd married the man suspected of causing her husband's death. "Do you ever regret leaving?" she asked Thomas one evening as they sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Not for a moment," he replied without hesitation. "Everything I truly need is right here." His hand caressed her rounded belly. "Though I do wonder sometimes what they'd think if they could see us now." Margaret smiled, imagining the gossips of Redemption confronted with the truth of their happy marriage. "They'd never believe it." "Their loss," Thomas murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Our gain." 3 days later, in the pale hours before dawn, Margaret woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. The contractions began shortly after, mild at first, but quickly gathering strength. True to his word, Thomas remained by her side throughout the long hours that followed, supporting her through each wave of pain, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement when she thought she couldn't continue. The doctor, initially skeptical of a husband's presence during birth, soon acknowledged Thomas's steady calm was a benefit rather than a hindrance. As evening approached, the ordeal reached its peak. Margaret, exhausted beyond measure, drew on, her last reserves of strength. Thomas held her hand, his face reflecting every contraction, as if sharing her pain. "One more push," the doctor urged. "The baby's almost here." With a final, tremendous effort, Margaret felt the child slip from her body, the sudden relief almost as overwhelming as the pain had been. A moment of silence, then a lusty cry filled the room, the sound they'd both been waiting months to hear. "Annie, healthy girl," the doctor announced, quickly wrapping the infant and performing his examination. Thomas pressed his forehead to Margaret's, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You were magnificent." The doctor approached with the swaddled infant. "Would you like to hold your daughter, Mrs. Cole?" Margaret reached out with trembling arms, accepting the tiny bundle. The child's face, red and wrinkled from the struggle of birth, was the most beautiful sight she'd ever beheld. Thomas perched beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other tentatively touching the baby's cheek with a single finger. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "We've been waiting for you." The doctor busied himself with final tasks, but Margaret noticed his frequent glances toward the baby, and Thomas's rapt expression as he gazed at the child. "Is something wrong?" she asked, suddenly anxious. "Not at all," the doctor assured her quickly. "It's just remarkable." He hesitated, then continued carefully. "The resemblance is quite striking." Margaret felt her heart stutter. "Resemblance?" "To your husband," the doctor clarified, nodding toward Thomas. "Those eyes, that chin, she's her father's daughter, no doubt about it." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a stunned look. The doctor, misinterpreting their silence, smiled indulgently. "First-time parents are always amazed by these things. I'll leave you three alone to get acquainted. Ring if you need anything." After he departed, Margaret unwrapped the blanket slightly, examining the infant with new eyes. The tiny chin with its distinct cleft, the shape of the eyes, the wisps of dark hair instead of Jacob's sandy blonde or her own copper, all unmistakably reminiscent of the man beside her. "Thomas," she whispered, "how is this possible?" He shook his head slowly, wonder and confusion warring in his expression. "I don't know." The baby opened her eyes then, eyes the exact shade of Thomas's, and gazed solemnly up at them both. Dr. Walsh said sometimes a woman who cannot conceive with one man might find success with another, Margaret recalled, her voice barely audible. He called it incompatibility. But we never... Thomas stopped, his brow furrowing in concentration. Then his eyes widened with sudden realization. The blizzard, last February, before the town council meeting. Margaret's memory flashed back to that night, the worst of the winter storm, when Thomas had returned from the mine half frozen and she'd helped him warm up with heated blankets and her own body heat. Both had been half asleep, exhausted from fighting the cold. Could we have? She breathed, the possibility almost too miraculous to contemplate. Thomas looked from the baby to Margaret, awe dawning across his features. "She's mine," he whispered. "Truly mine. Ours," Margaret corrected, taking his hand and placing it gently on their daughter's head. "Truly ours." In that moment, holding the child they'd created together without even realizing it, Thomas and Margaret felt the final piece of their unlikely story fall into place, a miracle neither had dared hope for, born from a union forced by circumstance but transformed by love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Don't miss any upload from us. Don't miss any